Now that we've got many of our definitions covered in other videos, including my final definition of intercultural competence, we should look at some basic understandings of cultural difference established by Edward T. Hall. The three dyads I will present are foundational for understanding cultural differences and the conflict that underlies intercultural relations. We'll discuss three of Hall's basic concepts for intercultural differences that lead to intercultural conflict, namely Proxemics, Kinesics, and Chronemics. The reason to do this is to introduce you to cultural difference and to discuss the nonverbal aspects of these three in particular. Gelfand et al. Provide a loose versus tight cultural comparison that seems binary in nature, and dividing different cultures into binary opposition is one approach to viewing culture. I prefer to look at these as dyads for a variety of reasons that I will address and present in another presentation video. But first, as we begin to approach intercultural difference, some of Hall's most basic ideas presented as dyads will be interesting to discuss. Let's take a look one at a time. When we're talking about dyadic pairs of cultural difference, you can see that culture is all good, or cultural differences that we are discussing here are not unacceptable ways of being or acting. They're all on the good side of what is considered broadly as acceptable behaviors. As you can see in the diagram, keep this chart in mind, and this diagram in mind, as there will be more on this specific chart later in another presentation. Proxemics are how close you can position yourself to another person before they or you become uncomfortable. Think about this. What determines your sense of personal space? What is your sense of personal space? What happens if someone violates that space? And have you ever had an interpersonal conflict because of personal space? Whether you are a close touching person or are part of the distant restraint side of the dyad, like me, this is a definite unconscious preference, often determined by your culture, your family, and your local customs. The Proxemics dyad is a nonverbal aspect of cultural difference that in certain contexts often goes unrecognized as a cultural difference. Edward Hall gives us this dyad. He does not call it a dyad, nor does he describe or define either side of this pair, as I have done. All of those terms are mine based on his description of this cultural difference. An example, Seinfeld plays with this difference intraculturally, or within our own first culture, with the close talker character played by Judge Reinhold in that comic series, Seinfeld. I think any of us would feel uncomfortable in that situation, but what is your preferred distance? When someone invades that or seems to be too far, what effect does that have on how comfortable people are in that interaction? Look for this in your life going forward. What about kinesics? Kinesics are bodily expressions and body language, or bodily movement and gesticulation. While Brazilians and Italians have reputations and are as very expressive, East Asian cultures not so much. So think about it. What determines how we express ourselves physically? Are we aware of how we express ourselves bodily? Are you? Are you aggravated or animated by how someone expresses themselves through their body? So along with the kinesics dyad, once again here I'm calling it a dyad and defining the named dyadic pair on either side, which Hall did not do. You've got the expressive gesticulators on one side, those who use their hands while talking, and on the other side, the stoically reticent group like me, who tend to keep quiet and speak when spoken to with little physical movement. Which one are you? Do you ever feel uncomfortable with one style or the other? While this may be a cultural difference, it doesn't normally result in full-on intercultural conflict. But as another nonverbal expression of culture, is worth noting and paying attention to how people react when someone is pushing against the local norm. Finally, probably the most common source of cultural differences at all levels of culture, both intraculturally, personally between you and your friends, and interculturally, is chronemics, a person's sense of time or the time orientation of the culture. Think about your own relationship to time. Where did that sense of time come from? How do you feel about others' relationship with time? Is there an overall cultural expectation in your first culture with regard to time? And have you ever had a conflict with someone over time in relation to respect? Unlike the other two nonverbal aspects of culture, Chronemics had two well-defined extremes that come from Hall's explanation of them. And these are his terms. Hall said that a monochronic culture takes time seriously, and all the trains of a monochronic culture run on time. Not arriving on time is an offense to the monochronic person. Monochronic cultures value taking turns when speaking as well. Hall gives us a very robust explanation of the monochronic and the polychronic. The polychronic folks, on the other hand, don't give as much import to time. They don't worry about wasting time with small talk. In fact, time as wasted is not even a concept for the polychronically oriented person. Arriving on time is not important, and if you get there within a certain reasonable window, but not early, then it's all good. Polychronic people often talk over each other at the same time. I grew up monochronic, and my wife polychronic. Imagine the opportunities for intercultural learning and intercultural competence development over the course of our 28 years of marriage. These expressions of cultural difference are important for a few reasons. First, they're all nonverbal and so are below the level of our consciousness. If you think of the iceberg model, it's below the water. We probably get angry or feel offended, but don't know why. And culture is the culprit here. The difference of how I treat these differences, as I treat them as dyads, not binaries, culture normally will have a preponderance of people who prefer one side of the other of the dyad, but they are not in opposition, and most cultures have a healthy number of close talkers who make everyone around them uncomfortable, and they still don't know why that happens. No one in the interaction understands why. I prefer cultures as dyadic continua, like Gary Weaver presents in his book. Any culture may be an extreme, but normally it will occur somewhere in between with the preferred way of being determined by the majority of the people and their preferences. That's culture. Culture is not a binary category in these terms, and that is fundamental to understanding cultural differences. What are some other culturally determined continua or spectra where we might define the extremes and through research discover whether our first culture is on one side or another, and our second culture is similar or the opposite? We can use these terms and categories to help us anticipate cultural differences, to predict them when they arise, and to mitigate for them to be effective and appropriate. After all, if you know someone is from a gesticulating, close-touching culture, you may have to be forgiving and be comfortable with your lack of comfort. That's what interculturally competent is. That's what being interculturally competent is, after all, isn't it? While I use these videos as presentations for the courses I teach on intercultural competence, they're also freely available for anyone to watch. So please feel free to like it or subscribe to this channel as you see fit, or share it. Your feedback is valuable to me, and that helps me make sure that things are clear. And may you find the peace that you are looking for.